The realignment of the California prison system has quickly and dramatically reduced the state's prison population. As more offenders are either serving their time in county jails or out on probation, the question most are asking is whether the emptying of state prisons is resulting in more crime. The nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California has published a series of reports that address that question. Our guests are the authors of those reports. Dr. Magnus Lofstrom, a senior fellow at the PPIC and an expert on public safety and realignment, and Brandon Martin, a research associate at PPIC specializing in criminal justice and corrections issues. Realignment: is more street time resulting in more street crime?
Additional funding for the Maddy report made possible by a grant from Paramount Agricultural Companies, growing healthy food for you and your family.
From the California Channel at the state capitol, Valley PBS, and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. When realignment was passed in 2011, critics said it would result in a spike in crime. Were they right? Our guest is Dr. Magnus Lofstrom, a senior fellow at the nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California and an expert on public safety and realignment. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you, Mark.
So let's start with a brief description of what is realignment.
So realignment was really the state's response to a federal court order mandate to reduce the prison population by more than 30,000 and addressing unconstitutionally poor prison conditions. The way that realignment addressed this was to shift responsibilities and funding from the state to the counties. It was intended to reduce reliance on incarceration and increased use of evidence-based practices. To do that, more specifically, what it did is it focuses on lower-level felons. These are your non-serious, non-sexual, non-violent offenders. And most of newly sentenced triple nons or lower-level felons will now serve their term in jail instead of state prison.
So the triple nons is, again, just to be clear about that, it's non-serious,
non-violent, non-sexual.
Non-sexual, okay.
Right. And the other key part was parole violators. So you can no longer send back a parole violator to state prison. They are now sanctioned locally in the county.
I think they call them frequent flyers. They keep coming back.
That's right. These were the churners of frequent flyers.
Yeah, one thing I want to explain to our audience is that people sometimes misunderstand, prison and jail and parole and probation. And just to be very clear about it, when you talk about prisons and parole, that's state.
Right.
And when you talk about jails and probation, that's county. It's very specific. Sometimes you kind of gloss over those words, but they really have different meanings.
That's right.
So what do the proponents tout as the advantages of realignment?
Well, besides not having to resort to releasing 30-some-odd thousand inmates early from state prison, cost saving was one big benefit of this. It was expected with the reduced reliance on incarceration that would lead to cost saving. And also the opportunity to reduce recidivism, reoffending amongst released offenders.
They thought they'd do better at the local level.
Exactly. The locals can do a better job. We had a high recidivism rate. About 2/3 of released offenders were back in state prison within 3 years.
2/3, wow. Okay, so what were the criticisms or concerns with realignment?
Well, the concerns were a number. Capacity was one, both at the county jails and probation. There were concerns as well about funding. So both in terms of sufficient levels of fundings and also the stability of funding. And then, of course, with the reduced reliance on incarceration, the concern was there regarding public safety. The crime was going to help.
Yeah. So they wanted to know, where's the money to do this, and are these people now out on the street going to cause more crime?
Right.
Okay, Proposition 30 plays a role in this. What was the role that Prop 30 played in realignment?
Prop 30 was very important because it provided a constitutional protection of the funding for realignment. And it
answered the money question.
Exactly, it does, and provides the stability that counties now know that these money will come in. And in terms of making long-term investments, that's key. If you don't think that the money is going to be there next year, you're not going to make the long-term kind of investment decisions that I think are necessary in order to be successful here.
So, so you had realignment, and one of the issues was they wanted to reduce state prison overcrowding because of these federal court decisions. What impact did realignment have on addressing that problem?
It had a big impact. It reduced the state prison population quite dramatically by about 27,000 in the first year alone. That's about a 17% drop. But we haven't seen any further reductions.
Can we put that in context? How many people were in a prison at that time, state prison?
The total prison population at that time was
about 150,000 or so?
It was about 150 55,000 or so.
Yeah. I'm just trying to get an idea because so people can understand.
Right.
A huge chunk.
It's a 17% drop. So the 27,000 in the first year alone is a 17% drop in the prison population. And we haven't seen reduction since then. So all the decline in the prison population was the first year.
Wow. Okay. Off the cliff, and then it kind of plateaued out.
It leveled out.
Okay. So what impact did it have on county jails? You're now shifting these people, some of them,
Exactly.
to county jail.
Well, county jail populations increased, not surprisingly. In the first year, if you focus on the first year, which is where you see most of the action here, it increased by about 9,000. And since then, we've seen an additional 2,000 increase.
So
in the
it
jail
wasn't a
population.
one-to-one correlation. In other words, you didn't release someone from state prison and they automatically went to county jail. Actually, it was less than that.
It was much less than that. So we see that for every 3 fewer offenders being sent to state prison, the county jail population went up by 1.
Oh, okay. So 1 to 3 ratio.
Yes.
Okay. So if we look at the total number of incarcerated in California, both in state prisons and county jails, note that distinction. What did it do in terms of incarceration rates?
So what we see here then is, so if you take those two numbers, I think is a good way to think about this. We see a reduction of 27,000 in the state prison population, an increase of 9,000 if we focus on that first year alone in the county jail population. What it means is that there are about 18,000 offenders who are not incarcerated as a result of realignment. In terms of incarceration rates, it brought us down to the levels that we saw in the early 1990s.
So you're seeing those people, 18,000, doing street time as opposed to jail time.
That's right. They're not incarcerated.
Okay. What about the state prison population as a result of realignment? How did that change?
Well, I think, one way to look at this is it intended to address the court order, the federal court order to bring down the prison population to 137.5% of its designed capacity. It did bring it down quite dramatically, 27,000, as I said, in the first year, but we didn't reach that mandated target. We've added some capacity with in-state beds, community correctional facilities, and also through a new medical correctional facility as well. We're still 3,000 short.
Okay. Well, up next, we're going to talk to another expert at the PPIC about what realignment has meant for counties and jails and the jails that they operate. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're now joined by Brandon Martin, a research associate with the PPIC specializing in criminal justice and corrections issues. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you, Mark.
So, county governments took over 3 new responsibilities as a result of realignment. What were they?
Sure. First, county jails now house lower-level felons. These are the non-serious, non-violent, non-sexual felons.
The triple nons.
The triple nons, as they're called, yes. They used to spend their sentences in state prison. They're now held in county jail. Second, parole violators now spend that time in county jail. So previously on parole, you would spend the violation time in state prison, but now you also spend that in county jail instead. And third, county probation departments are now in charge of supervising lower-level felons that come out of state prison that previously would have gone on state parole. They're now on county probation.
Right, state parole versus county probation.
Yes.
We talked about that earlier. Okay, so realignment gave counties considerable discretion. What are some of the non-jail alternatives that counties can use to address this issue?
Yeah, counties were given great discretion in choosing the programming that they want. The state expanded eligibility for electronic monitoring, day reporting center, and work alternative programs. The state also created new tools, and one of those tools is called split sentencing. And so this allows a judge for certain felons, when sentencing them, to give them a split sentence. So a period of incarceration in county jail followed by a period of what we call mandatory supervision in the community under the control of county probation.
So the question is, some of these methods sound like they're going to be less expensive, electronic monitoring as opposed to being in jail or prison. The question is, are they as effective? But let's talk about county response to realignment. Have counties been consistent in their response to realignment?
So because of the discretion given to counties, we see variation across the state in responses. We don't have complete information on the differences in programming and the numbers in these programs, such as electronic monitoring and the use of that, but we do know that there are wide variations in the use of split sentencing. So Contra Costa and Stanislaus County use over 80% of the cases available get split sentences. That's compared to Alameda in Los Angeles, which have used it roughly less than 10% of the cases.
So wide
available.
variation how counties
Very wide
respond.
variation.
Some counties are under court-imposed capacity caps.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering, what's been the main response to realignment in those counties?
So unfortunately, we don't have detailed information on the jail population management choices in those counties, but we do see after realignment that early releases are up in those counties, and the jail populations continue to rise in those counties.
So they're letting more people out.
Yes, so as they've filled up the jails, they're under court caps that require them to release once they reach a certain number.
So generally, have counties been able to adequately respond to realignment?
Counties are doing the best they can with the funding and programming available, but once again, we have seen that early releases are up since realignment.
So there are some counties that are now, that weren't operating at 100% capacity, now are operating.
Yes, so even before realignment, the statewide jail system operated at about 90% of capacity, and now we're at roughly 110% of capacity.
Okay, more than that. Okay. So what's happening to county jails then to make room for these 3 non-felony offenders who are no longer in state prison? How are they?
So we don't know the exact choices of the counties, whether they're making sure they keep them in jail versus individuals that might have misdemeanors. But what we do see is that early releases are up. We hope that if they're using early releases, that they're using a valid risk-based model to release people.
Yes, we would hope so.
And so you would hopefully see misdemeanors being released first versus more serious offenses like triple nons.
So what factors might affect a county's realignment strategy?
So setting aside sort of the previous choices and just looking post-realignment, we think that both the physical and staffing capacities of the counties in the jails and also probation are huge factors. If you don't have room in your jail to do programming, if you don't have space for it, you're unable to do that programming.
What about politics?
So politics, that varies from county to county, but you do see choices in the incarceration rates before realignment that have also continued.
I mean, it's kind of, you know, in politics you can have this tough on crime strategy,
Yep.
or you can have more of a reentry strategy. Are you seeing that play out at the county level?
I mean, there are wide variation. You know, San Francisco beforehand had programming already in place, and they've used their money to expand that programming. Other counties have chosen to close wings of their jails with that money and sort of reopen them and house as many people as they can.
So are you seeing jail capacity challenges increasing or decreasing over time? And are things going to get worse before they get better?
So since the start of realignment, we've seen the jail population increase monthly. And we believe that that will continue to happen in the short term, that jail population will go up. The state is investing $2.2 billion in new county jail construction. And so our report shows that by 2020, in a lot of these counties that have capacity issues, there will be some relief. But you have to remember that if you look long-term out to 2040, the state's population growth will affect several counties, especially in the Central Valley.
Okay, well, I want to thank Brandon Martin for joining us. Up next, what impact, if any, has realignment had on crime rates? The PPIC's Dr. Magnus Lofstrom will rejoin us for that conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're rejoined by the PPIC's Dr. Magnus Lofstrom, a co-author of several reports on crime and realignment. So what has been the general crime trends in California over the last few years? What have you seen?
Well, we've seen a long-term decline in crime rates in California, and specifically if we look at violent crime, it's been coming down since the early 1990s. Property crime rates have been coming down since the 1980s, early 1980s. So as a result, and it's pretty consistent. It's been some years where it's been coming up, but long-term decline. And as a result, now in recent years, we are at levels that we haven't seen since the 1960s.
Really? Wow. So it's going to be going down. You know, normally you expect, like in a recession, maybe crime rates are going to go up, but you've generally seen a downward trend.
Well, they do. I think it's, you know, in every year there are changes, but you know, from a long-term perspective, we've been on a very serious and steep decline in crime rates in California and the nation as a whole.
So if we're looking at counties, let's break it down now from state to county level. Are there differences in crime rates? I assume there are among counties, and does it matter if we're talking about violent crime or property crime?
Well, there are big differences in crime rates across the counties, and we see the lowest crime rates are generally found in our small and rural counties, as well as our Southern California coastal counties like Ventura, San Diego, and Orange County. The highest crime rates in general are really in the relatively poor San Joaquin, Central Valley, but also in San Francisco. San Francisco has some of the highest property crime rates as well as robbery rates.
Interesting. Well, so we were talking earlier about this 18,000 person gap between who has been in prison prior to realignment and who ended up in county jail. So many of these triple nons, as you referred to earlier, these offenders are doing probation, i.e. street time, instead of jail time. So what effect, if any, has this increase in street time because of realignment had on crime in California?
Well, I think it's fair to say that this is really the main concern with realignment, the additional offenders on the street as a result of the reform. And so in a report that we released in December of last year, we looked specifically at the effect of that. And we looked at the changes in the incarceration rates and the crime rates across the counties to see if they were correlated. And more specifically, we looked at if there was any evidence that as the county saw more offenders on the street, whether crime rates went up. And generally speaking, we found that it really had a very limited and modest effect on crime.
So even if you had more people doing street time, you didn't see an increase necessarily in crime?
We saw, so we broke it down by violent and property crime. So if we start by looking at violent crime, we found no evidence that violent crime went up as a result of realignment and the additional offenders on the street. Counties that saw more offenders on the street as a result of realignment saw no more violent crime. Than those counties that saw less.
Okay, now let's talk about property crimes. A little different. What impact has it had on property crimes, and any specific types of property crimes more affected than others?
Right. So for property crimes, we do find that realignment had an impact. We found that property crime and especially auto theft rates went up as a result of realignment. And we estimate that the auto theft rate went up by about 65 per 100,000 residents. It's about 24,000 auto thefts in that first year of realignment alone. But just to put that in perspective, we had a declining trend in auto thefts before this. So it brought us back to the rates that we've seen as recently as 2009.
So it's still relatively low is what you're saying, but it did trend up.
And from a time perspective, it's low, but California has the nation's highest auto theft rate.
We love our cars in California,
We
don't we? Okay. So you also note in your report, however, that many factors contribute to crime trends. So how do we know if realignment is or is not the cause of these trends?
Right. So there are a number of things that could affect this, and it's a very difficult question to answer. And we think that we did a very careful analysis where we made sure that we addressed fundamental things that could affect the relationship between realignment and crime rates. We took into account county differences in terms of their ability, capacity that existed before realignment. We looked at underlying trends at the county level that could have been in place and could then have led to these kind of results. Controlled for all that in our statistical methods, the economy.
So you tried to cover everything, and what did you find?
We covered everything, but we also took a step back and we looked at other states. We compared California to other states, and the idea here that, well, if realignment is really behind anything that we see in California, we ought to stand out because no other state passed a reform of this magnitude at that particular point in time.
And you didn't find.
So what we did, we compared California's crime trends to comparison states that had very similar trends prior to realignment to California. And what we find is that violent crime rate trends stayed the same as the comparison states. Property crime started to diverge in 2011, and in 2012 there was a noticeable
And specifically
gap.
within property crimes, auto thefts.
Auto theft, exactly. So what we find in the state comparison is exactly what you see in the county level.
We've only got about 30 seconds left in this segment. I want to ask you though, state prisons are still about 3,000 over the federal cap for capacity, and the capacity is 137.5% of design capacity. In other words, we'll allow you to go beyond 100%, but beyond 137.5%, that's too much according to the federal courts. So in your judgment, if they now use realignment or they remove people from state prison to lower that number to the 137% that the federal courts want, what is that going to do to crime rates?
Well, I think it's difficult to say exactly what it's going to do because it's going to depend on who is actually affected by it. Who is it who's not going to be incarcerated as a result of further changes? So that's difficult to say because of that. But I think it's important that we keep in mind that the 3,000 or so that we need to bring it down, that's a small fraction of what we saw with realignment, and it had a modest and limited impact.
Right. Okay, well, up next, what are the most effective crime control strategies in the age of realignment? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Although controversial, crime prevention can be put in the context of a cost-benefit analysis. In short, what is the most cost-effective way to address crime? We're talking to the PPIC's Dr. Magnus Lofstrom. So let's start with a basic question. Is incarceration an effective crime control or public safety strategy?
Well, the crime preventive effectiveness of incarceration really depends on your reliance on it. Like so many other things, you know, policy tools and strategies, if you use it too much, it might not be particularly effective. And if we look at research that addressed the crime preventive effect of incarceration in the 1970s, when we had very low incarceration rates similar to what they are in Europe today, maybe 1/6 of what we see today, that research finds broad crime preventive effects. It prevented both violent and property crime.
But what you're saying, though, there is kind of a law of diminishing returns, though, isn't it?
That's right. That's exactly what's going on here, because as we fast forward and we're increasing our incarceration rates, we are changing and adding offenders and the length of terms that they serve in prisons. And when we look at the research that is looking at incarceration rates at the level that we are at now, finds a much lower crime preventive effect of incarceration,
Okay.
and that it's not a very cost-effective way of preventing crime.
Okay, so let's focus on property crimes for a second here, and specifically auto thefts, which you said appear to be on the rise as a result of realignment. That's what the statistics show. What's the most cost-effective way to deal with property crimes generally and auto thefts in particular?
Well, if you know, our research actually gives us some very useful information when it comes to the crime preventive effect and the cost benefits of incarceration. We estimate that for each offender who's being incarcerated at the incarceration rates we were at the time of the realignment, that it prevents about 1.2 property crimes, specifically auto thefts. So
Okay.
that's for each year of prison incarceration, it prevents 1.2 auto thefts.
And let's give it a specific number. So the average cost of incarcerating someone in state prisons is a little over $51,000. And the average property crime or auto theft is, I think I read in your report, something around the range of $11,000, $12,000.
It adds. So for these 1.2, the benefit that we receive from locking someone up for 1 year is $12,000 worth of crime prevention.
And it's costing us $51,000 in putting them in prison.
For additional dollar that we spend on incarceration at these levels, we get about 23 cents back in crime prevention.
Okay, let's talk about violent crimes. A little more difficult subject, but
Right.
what does your research tell you about whether incarceration is a cost-effective strategy to reduce violent crime?
Well, so again, when we look at incarceration rates where we're at, we don't find any evidence that incarceration actually prevents violent crime. So instead, if violent crime is what we would like to decrease, and I think most people are interested in that specifically, we need to look for alternatives. Policing is one much more effective strategy. If we do the same kind of calculation for adding an additional law enforcement officer, the crime preventive savings that we get for a dollar spent on that is $1.60.
So, but let me go back to violent crimes for a second. So I think I read in your report that, I think you cited a RAND study that said that the average cost of a robbery is $70,641. That's pretty specific.
Right.
But again, incarceration cost is about $52,000 to keep someone in
Right.
prison. So why isn't that cost effective?
Well, we don't find that robberies really, that incarceration prevents robberies at the incarceration rates where we are at right now. So with adding an offender to state prison at the levels we're at now, you're not preventing robberies.
Okay.
You are preventing auto thefts. But violent crime, if that's the concern, we need to look for alternative strategies.
So in terms of deterrent effect of incarceration, you're saying not so much when it comes to violent crime.
There's very little evidence that incarceration has a big deterrent effect. The main effect of incarceration in terms of crime prevention is really incapacitation. That is taking an offender off the street.
Okay. So you get to solve the problem now in about a minute. That's okay. So what does your research suggest is the most cost-effective crime control strategy? You mentioned police.
Right.
What else?
Well, I think it's what we need to think about here is that we don't want to just put all the eggs in one basket here. We want to look at and find the right mix of crime preventive strategies, and in doing so, we also need to figure out and think about the timing of the effects. So when we channel these savings from reduced incarceration, we have offenders on the street. We need to address that right away. Increased policing is one effective way of deterring that kind of situation happening. Further down the road, you want to think about evidence-based practices that will reduce reoffending, but that will take some time before most of that will actually be noticeable. But we also need to have a long-term perspective on this as well. So we would like to see strategies that actually addresses and prevents at-risk youth from entering the criminal justice system. So now we're looking at dropout prevention, other kind of strategies to improve educational outcomes among at-risk youth. In general, I think what we need to think of is finding the right mix of crime preventive strategies.
You've got short and long-term strategies. Well, I want to thank our guests from the Nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California, Dr. Magnus Lofstrom and Brandon Martin, for joining us. If you want to stay current on state politics, you can log on to our website and read the Maddy Daily, and that's for free by just logging on to our website at www.maddyinstitute.org. And now, another perspective.
When realignment was first proposed, one of the concerns was that it would reduce the prison population at the expense of increasing the jail population in the 58 counties of the state. And indeed, that has happened, and in some counties more than others. But there are things that counties can do to reduce the overcrowding in jails. And one of these is to make greater use of community-based corrections. This can be done in conjunction with incarceration as well, such as with the split sentences that were talked about earlier in the program. Community-based corrections can make use of evidence-based practices. These are practices or programs that have been shown to reduce reoffending in other parts of the country. These kinds of programs, like substance abuse counseling, vocational training, mental health programs, education programs, have been shown to reduce reoffending when applied in the right circumstances with the right kind of offenders. Community-based programs are cheaper than incarceration, of course, and they can make a long-term difference. They can reduce reoffending, they can reduce overcrowding in the jails, and they can keep the community safer when they're applied in the appropriate ways. For the Maddy Report, I'm Emma Hughes.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the Maddy Institute, the California Channel, Casey, or Valley PBS. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions shared in the Maddy Report, visit our website at valleypbs.org/Maddy. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.